you're harder to see, you're harder to shoot at. That is the principle that has driven camouflage as an essential military tactic.
Ever since the birth of the tank, the question of how to conceal these big, noisy, smoking metal chunks has occupied military thinkers, with the aim of increasing the advantage a tank can bring to the battlefield. It's not easy, and throughout history, it's presented some interesting challenges that have led to some creative and surprising solutions. Let's look at the evolution of tank camouflage and the art of battlefield deception.
This video has been made possible by our supporters on Patreon, our YouTube members, and our super thanks donors. Please join them if you can, and support the Tank Museum. And thanks for watching.
Anyone who's done basic training will tell you the principles of not being seen are shadow, shine, silhouette, shape, spacing, and finally, movement. With tanks, movement, spacing and silhouette are taken care of through tactical driving and the use of terrain. Using contours, woodblock, and hull-down firing positions, a tank can make itself less conspicuous, avoiding being skylined at all costs.
The others, shape, shine and shadow, are as vitally important today in camouflage terms as they were in 1916. Until it was first deployed, the tank was a secret weapon. In fact, even the name itself was a piece of deception, trying to lull onlookers and any passing German spies into the idea that these big metal objects were just harmless water carriers. I don't know if that worked, but the name obviously stuck.
In the secrecy surrounding the development of the tank, the society artist Solomon J. Solomon, who'd been commissioned into the British Army, was sent to devise schemes for the first British Mark I tanks.
The first tanks to see action on September the 15th, 1916 were painted in this camouflage, and we've reconstructed it here on our Mark I tank. As you can see, it is to modernise a fairly sort of standard disruptive pattern, irregular blodges of 4 different colours.
This was one of several schemes that were proposed at a time when dazzle schemes were in use by the Royal Navy to visually distort the appearance of ships. They won't be hidden completely, but the scheme does make it harder to gauge their speed, size and direction.
Other schemes were quite a bit more complex. This model from 1917 was executed by Percival Tudor Hart. He was a Canadian artist of what's called the Vorticist school, and like a lot of other artists, he volunteered to assist the war effort.
The problem is that this fussy herringbone effect is far too fine to be effective and too complex to replicate. Basically just an interesting texture on what is still a tank shape. So it failed to impress the military.
Putting this in simple terms, a disruptive pattern has to be bold enough to disrupt. Painted camouflage was really quite wasted on tanks in the First World War because it just got covered in mud and the patterns were obscured. So what they tended to do is just paint things this standard sort of olivey green colour. However, that didn't mean that all attempts at deception with a paintbrush were abandoned. This Whippet tank demonstrates that.
These black lines were painted on to replicate and conceal the driver and commander's vision ports, making it harder for German machine gunners to know where to aim. The artist Solomon spent his war dedicated to the science of military camouflage, and in 1920 he published his book, Strategic Camouflage. In it, he makes the crucial observation that the other side of the hill no longer exists. That relates to the successful development of aerial reconnaissance in the last war.
Tanks were now at much as risk from the air as they were from the ground. Solomon was convinced that it wasn't possible to camouflage a tank effectively without addressing the problem of the shadow it cast, either to the side or underneath. And this problem was initially addressed by the use of camouflage painted tarpaulins. He was also a passionate advocate of the use of camouflage netting, and he was convinced, not without some reason, that the German army was hiding vast quantities of men and material under netting. The British Army on this occasion did listen, and the large-scale production of camouflage netting began in 1917.
This, along with the importance of finding a suitable woodblock to leaguer in overnight, is what the mechanised force was taught during the 1920s and 1930s.
Vehicle paint schemes tended to be limited, certainly in the British Army, to the use of dark bronze green for temperate conditions and a sand colour, which they termed light stone, for desert use. Now, there's a bit of evidence from Egypt in the 1930s the two were combined, but it's actually rather difficult to tell from a black and white photograph. Certain peacetime army practices didn't exactly aid camouflage either. Particularly the fondness for senior officers and NCOs to sort of have everything polished to within an inch of its life wasn't helpful. In the field, a vehicle looking like that would send a myriad of heliograph beams to any enemy observer. Come wartime, the bull would have to go.
With the outbreak of World War II, tanks would have to operate in a wide range of environments, from the battlefields of Europe to the jungles of Southeast Asia.
In terms of camouflage, the French army was one of the most inventive, and they got a huge range of schemes. And one of them is reconstructed here on this Saumur S35. And you can see it's a fairly complex brown, yellow, army green pattern. That would have been factory applied, but here we have it reconstructed for exhibition purposes.
It's a disruptive pattern. It's designed to break up the outline of the tank, and it's one of quite a large number used by the French army, though I can't imagine the large regimental device would have helped. One of the most challenging environments in many ways was the western desert of North Africa. Harshness of the climate aside, the almost total lack of cover made any attempt to hide from the enemy difficult. But one innovative British scheme pioneered a solution.
The Caunter scheme, which was devised by a Colonel Caunter of 4th Armoured Brigade, was an angular, sharp-edged pattern of light stone, silver grey and slate.
This was used on a variety of vehicles from trucks to tanks, and we have a reconstructed example here on this Matilda too. You can see there's a small area of surviving original paint at this end. It's a form of dazzle camouflage, and it's designed to break up the outline of a vehicle in desert conditions, particularly in conditions of dust and heat haze.
It's a fairly short-lived scheme. It's introduced in 1940, but by October 1941, instructions from the War Office are that all vehicles will just revert to all-over sand. The reason for this is that elaborate camouflage schemes don't work very well when they're covered in a layer of desert dust.
One form of camouflage that was of value in the wide open spaces of the desert involved deception. Tanks were disguised as trucks and vice versa, with wood and canvas sun shields. As the value of visual deception became clear, Geoffrey Barkas, a theatrical producer, was appointed as camouflage officer GHQ Cairo in 1941. He went on to devise phantom armies of vehicles, artillery, and even railheads and stores depots. Malta, especially during the siege of June 1940 to December 1942, was one of the most bombed places on the planet. Consequently, camouflage was of vital importance, and the idiosyncratic Malta scheme was applied to tanks, trucks, guns, and even steel helmets. Based on the island's landscape of broken limestone, a crazy paving effect of pale sand with darker lining was painted, sometimes being reversed to light irregular splotches on a dark background. One of the most niche camouflage forms ever invented, it remains a distinctive reminder of some of the island's darkest days.
From 1937 to 1940, German tanks were painted with a base coat of dunkelgrau, dark grey, which is sometimes probably erroneously called panzergrau, with a 1/3 application of dunkel brown, dark brown. In July 1940, the decision is made to leave off the brown paint. And then in February 1943, the base coat is changed to dunkelgelb, dark yellow, because this blends better with a rural environment. As the war progresses, and this particularly happens on the Eastern Front, we see a proliferation of tank and AFV camouflage patterns. They're not particularly regulated, they seem to be almost unit-based, and they revolve around a base coat of dark yellow with patches or stripes of red, brown and dark green.
This is sometimes referred to as Normandy camouflage, though I doubt that's a contemporary term, and it certainly wasn't confined to Normandy in use.
The new emphasis on camouflage is a reflection of the fact that the Wehrmacht is increasingly on the back foot. An army which is attacking going forward is less concerned with hiding its vehicles than an army which is being driven backwards and frequently having to operate from cover.
From August 1944, a formal directive was issued for a pattern designated Hinterhalttarnung, ambush camouflage.
As you can see in this semi-reconstruction on our Tiger II, the scheme is a base coat of dunkelgelb with patches and stripes in olive green and rotbraun. It's meant to aid camouflage in something like a woodblock environment, and it's meant to mimic the effect of light passing through trees. The Hinterhalttarnung scheme continues with variations up to the end of the war, but eventually it gets to the stage where tanks like this Panther are leaving the factory just with a coat of red oxide primer, and then a camouflage scheme really just made up of whatever paint is available at the time. If the German army is thinking defensively, the Allies after D-Day are very much on the offensive, and camouflage schemes are just about abandoned in favour of plain olive green, and especially on upper surfaces, the universal white star, and that's about air recognition. The Allies have just about total air superiority, so being able to tell friend from foe is vitally important.
One very specific exception to this was the use of paint schemes and false muzzle brakes to disguise the long barrel of the 17-pounder gun mounted in the Sherman Firefly. In a troop of basic 75mm Sherman gun tanks, the Firefly would always be a priority target for enemy gunners, so the subterfuge was all about allowing the Firefly to survive long enough to do its job.
Tank crews have always been quite naturally inventive, and the simplest form of applied camouflage is just to cut branches, natural foliage, and pile them on top so that you can blend your vehicle in, a bit like an infantryman would on a smaller scale with helmet and webbing. In the winter, when it's snowy, such as on the Eastern Front, and we've got a KV-1 tank here, this would have been painted olive green, but it's been repainted just with domestic whitewash. And that works extremely well. And it's also good news when you consider the fact that come the spring, the rains will wash it off. Coming into the Cold War, camouflage is dictated by the intentions of NATO or the Warsaw Pact.
Warsaw Pact forces adopted an aggressive posture. Should war break out, the Soviet Union and our allies would use their massive numerical superiority to attack across the inner German border, the intention being to reach the western coast of France within 2 weeks.
As we've said, camouflage is usually far more important to a defender than an aggressor. So the vast number of Warsaw Pact T-tanks were really just painted dark green. NATO, in a defensive posture, adopted a 3-colour palette of green, brown and black, though there are national variations. The US Army, the French Army use all 3. The British Army just uses olive green with a black overlying disruptive pattern. One imaginative exception to this was the Berlin camouflage scheme, and you can see that on this Fox armoured car in our collection. Now the Berlin scheme was devised by a cavalry officer, Major Clendon Dawkes. He was OC the 4th 7th Dragoon Guards Berlin Squadron. He realised that his chieftains, painted black and green, stuck out in an urban environment. So as an amateur watercolourist, he made some cardboard cutouts, stuck them in his window and experimented with different schemes. And the one he came up with was this. And this is blocks of different pastel shades. Straight lines, they actually blend the vehicle a lot better into something like a cityscape. On a higher level, in order to confuse the opposition, each vehicle of a particular type, each chieftain, say, was painted the same as every other chieftain. And hopefully that would confuse the numbers that are actually present, stationed in Berlin. Had the worst happened, the Berlin garrison would have been isolated and wiped out very quickly. But the rest of NATO forces in Germany would have carried out a fighting withdrawal across the North German plain.
In the face of overwhelming force, the chieftain main battle tanks of British Army of the Rhine, fighting from hull-down prepared positions, would have made the most of natural cover, woodblock, improved by camnet.
Modern camouflage netting consists of a frame-proof net with applied artificial camouflage. And it's draped over the vehicle and then either a framework or just wooden poles to obscure the hard outline. Now, for anyone who hasn't had the privilege of using a vehicle-sized camouflage net, I can tell them it's a horrific experience. It is generally either incredibly wet and muddy or dusty, so you get covered in filth. It snags on everything. And then just when you've got your hide perfected and you're sitting down and thinking about a brew, the signal comes, move now. And it's time to take the whole thing down and start the whole rigmarole all over again.
Digital camouflage, which is becoming increasingly common, makes the tank harder to detect by both the human eye and optical sensors. We have an early example here on our Jordanian Khalid MBT. Latest generation digital cam is printed and applied with the intention of making it modifiable for different terrain, although the only example I've seen to date takes 3 days to apply, so it's not exactly instantaneous.
Another type of camouflage, I think it's probably better termed an obscurant in fact, is smoke, and that's been in use since before World War II.
The majority of tanks and AFVs are fitted with multi-bank smoke grenade launchers that can drop a pattern of smoke grenades, usually white fuzz, in front of a vehicle to produce a localised smoke screen. These vary in design, with some early examples, like those on the British Matilda II, being made from repurposed rifle actions.
MBTs like this Challenger 2 also carry smoke shells for longer distance screening, and they can generate a localised smoke screen by venting fuel into the hot exhaust.
Where the grenades come into their own, though, is the ability to deploy a multispectral obscurant, often red phosphorus, which works against both visual and infrared observation. Moving on, there's one vehicle in our own collection which epitomises the challenges to tanks on the 21st century battlefield. The Chieftain Sid, better known as the Stealth Chieftain.
The signature integration demonstrator, this thing, was built as part of research into the Trigat LR anti-tank missile system. And that's a system that uses a mixture of passive infrared and laser guidance to home in on targets. The SID is quite simply designed to make it as difficult as possible for the missile to track.
It has a modified hull with angular shapes designed to reflect radar away from the vehicle, which is also covered with a radar-absorbing coating. The engine noise is dampened and the exhaust is routed downwards towards the bottom of the hull to minimise the telltale plume, and the tracks have anti-dust brushes fitted.
Trigat was not adopted by the British Army, but the SID seems to have been very effective in defeating the missile's sensors.
In the 100 years or so that tanks have existed, camouflage has come a long way from the basic painted schemes of World War I to the digital patterns of today.
On the modern battlefield, with increasing amounts of visual surveillance by satellite and drone, obscuring shine, shadow and shape is even more important. Colonel Solomon's other side of the hill certainly doesn't exist anymore. On the future battlefield, camouflage is likely to place as much emphasis on reducing noise and heat generation and radar signature. Possibly the future tank will be something like our stealth tank. We do hope you've enjoyed this video. Thanks for watching, and if you did, please subscribe, and if you can, please support us on Patreon.